Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Cohen. I'm a professor at the School of International Public Affairs and the Senior Vice Dean of the School of Professional Studies, where I also direct a program in sustainability management. I'm here representing our Dean, Troy Eggers, who's recovering from COVID and asked me to fill in for him tonight. So let me welcome you to the launch of our new master's program in political analytics and to this evening's panel discussion of the midterm elections. This panel, like our new and innovative master's program, is the result of a creative collaboration between the Department of Political Science and the School of Professional Studies. The title of the panel, as you can see, is Analytics and the 2022 Midterm Election, Strategy, Prediction, and Explanation. It's the first in a series of events we're hosting on the topic of political analytics. I want to thank my colleague, political science professor Greg Wawro, for convening this very high-powered panel tonight, and also to thank our terrific events team for all their hard work in making this evening happen. The midterm elections are right around the corner. Analytics and data are playing an ever-increasing and crucial role in modern politics. After several Supreme Court decisions, we've seen an explosion of the role of money in politics, creating increasing demand for analysis to make sure that all that money is effectively spent. Despite the growing demand for professionals in this field, there are very few, if any, academic programs that prepare students to excel in the changing landscape of political analytics. This emerging profession requires both an understanding of practical political strategy and advanced methods of quantitative analysis and model building. This program is going to train a new generation of political professionals to navigate a complicated data and strategic landscape of political professionals. We look forward to welcoming our first class in this program in the fall of 2023. We're uniquely positioned here at Columbia to offer this new program. We're able to draw on our terrific faculty in quantitative social sciences, political science, public policy, statistics, mathematical modeling, and applied analytics, and it's all to meet the needs of students who aspire to a career in political analytics and consulting. The program's faculty will include some of the most distinguished and accomplished scholars of political science and quantitative analysis in the nation. Professor of Political Science Greg Wawro is the program's founder. He's the former chair of political science, and he's a leader in the field of American politics. I'd like to again thank Professor Wawro and the rest of our panel for joining us this evening, including from the Department of Political Science, the Burgess Professor of Political Science, Donald Green, the Sayre Professor of Government and Professor of International and Public Affairs, Robert Shapiro. The panel also includes Shayla Murray, Columbia's Executive Vice President for Public Affairs and a past senior advisor to President Obama. It also includes Dr. Aaron Strauss, Program Director at Open Labs, and Dr. Doug Usher, Partner at Forbes Tate Partners. We are in for a fascinating discussion. So in addition to those of you in the room tonight, we have a number of folks joining us on live stream. So I want to thank you for tuning in. There'll be time for questions after the panel. And for those of you joining online, don't be afraid to ask some questions in the chat. For those of you who are in the room, please join us afterwards for refreshments in the rotunda. For those of you online, I guess it's Miller time. You're more than welcome to join us on campus for our next event. With that, Professor Wawro, I turn this evening to your capable hands.
I also want to extend my thanks to the staff of the School of Professional Studies for helping to organize and put on such a tremendous event. So I don't want to start the evening off on too overdramatic a note, but American democracy is in peril. A fundamental requirement of a healthy democracy is that parties that lose elections accept those losses and permit a peaceful transfer of power. Unfortunately, that is not what happened after the 2020 elections, and this raises the stakes for elections going forward. So it's my firm belief that understanding why elections turn out the way that they do is an essential component of maintaining a healthy democracy And analytics is a critical component of that. Analytics, as Steve mentioned, are everywhere in politics these days, but there are a few academic opportunities for students interested in political analytics to acquire the skills necessary to thrive in the increasingly data-driven world of politics. So we formed this unique partnership between the Department of Political Science and the School of Professional Studies. We have representatives of the department here this evening. I'm thankful for their participation. And to motivate our discussion here, this is a tremendous panel, and I'm so happy that everyone has agreed to participate. I had my own introductions for them, but I think Steve introduced them as well as I could. But I'm thrilled to welcome them here, and this is a panel of political professionals and scholars, and they are going to help us understand better what is happening in the 2022 midterm elections. As a political scientist, I think that all elections are interesting. There's usually less attention paid to midterm elections than there are to presidential elections, but as I stated, it's hard to imagine how stakes that could be higher than what we're facing, given the kinds of candidates that are running in this election, what they're campaigning on, and what we expect, how we expect policy to change if the elections turn out one way versus another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn some questions. They're going to comment. I hope the discussion will evolve more organically after we get through the first set of questions. We will have time for questions and answers. We'll get to that later. I would just ask that if you're going to ask a question, please ask your question in the form of a question, and we'll respond as well as we can. So Shayla Murray, I'd like to start with you. So you have been on both sides of the media microphone. You have served as a reporter covering many midterm elections. You have witnessed them from the front lines in the White House. And so you have extraordinary knowledge and perspective. So to start, can you give us a brief overview of how midterm election years differ from presidential election years, and what in particular stands out to you in the 2020 midterms compared to other recent elections? Are there any important subplots that we should be paying attention to?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. So I am a super fan of midterm elections because I think that they are more revealing and more interesting and usually more surprising than general election, presidential election cycles. The reason is because I think the general sense is that they are a verdict on where the country is at the moment and how the president's doing and the party in power is doing, but I actually tend to see them as a foreshadowing force that tells you kind of what's coming. And I will just, let me just go through the last 3 cycles and help you see the way that I see them. In 2006, the country had turned against the Iraq War. Hurricane Katrina had just left its mark on New Orleans, and it was expected and understood that the country was frustrated and deeply disappointed with the Bush presidency. So it wasn't surprising that it was a big Democratic wave election. But who was the Democratic, the surrogate that every candidate wanted to appear with on the campaign trail that summer and fall? It was a first-term senator named Barack Obama who had voted against not voted against the war, had opposed the war in Iraq and was emerging as this sort of new force in the party, and all of these red state Democrats brought him in to campaign for them. And I think I went to about 40 of those races as a reporter at that point, and all you had to do was see that guy in front of a crowd in Nebraska to know that this was for real. So 2010 was the Tea Party election. Remember that? Remember when people were really mad about Obamacare? Well, that was, yes, it was a reaction to Obamacare and some of the, whenever there's single party rule, there tends to be a little excessive force in Congress. And so definitely there was a reaction to that. But also what you saw was I think below the surface of a bunch of old people on Medicare protesting against government health care was this deeper veins, mainly related to immigration and how the country, especially the interior of the country, was changing as a result of that. So all those forces converged, led to a, well, it depends on what side you're on, devastating for Democrats, game-changing election for Republicans. And that set up what I think we saw more in 2014, which was Democrats lost a lot of Senate races in kind of red, purple states that cycle. It wasn't that surprising of an outcome, but there were some interesting data that came out of that election. For instance, a lot less ticket splitting than we've seen in the past, and then some. I think people were in Washington focused on the macroeconomic data that showed the country was recovering from the recession, but we knew by looking deep into the results of that election that the recovery just wasn't resonating in the country. And I think people like, for instance, a guy named Bernie Sanders picked up on that, but maybe someone named Hillary Clinton was a little late to that party. So what do you look for in a midterm election that makes them interesting? So like, what's the plot? And I think the plot is usually not what you'll hear people talking about on MSNBC or CNN or Fox for that matter, but you really want to pay attention to the issues that cut across political lines and may not even be presenting as overtly political. So for instance, right now, crime is one of those issues. Crime is a very personal issue for every individual, and no matter what party you affiliate with, your views on crime are generally separate from that. Education is another issue that I think is vastly appreciated this year, and is going to drive a lot of suburban voting in many, many important states. And that is simply the state of mind of millions of parents who have dealt with their kids at home for the last year and a half or two, and a school system that has failed them or that they perceive to have failed them, and we see the test scores and the results of that, and will for many years to come. So in the past, I think in 2014, you could look back and see the very beginnings of the opioid crisis, another thing that I remember in the White House thinking, opioids, wow, I had no idea, right around that time. And, that was when we first heard like the marijuana legalization debate, another thing that politicians didn't take seriously until it was sort of fomented up from these smaller races. Things like marijuana legislation and gay rights, both wildly overrated as issues. People thought, oh my God, the country's never going to go for this stuff. But again, these smaller regional elections reveal that people often get there before the pundits do. So I think the questions for this cycle, which I would just raise and not answer because that's what elections are for, but things to think about as you're paying attention. Will the Trump folks turn out for non-Trump candidates like Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania and J.D. Vance in Ohio? Those are two absolutely must-win Senate races for both parties, depending on, well, in most formulations. Neither one of those Republicans are necessarily affiliated with Trump, or he is not been particularly supportive of them. So that's going to be very interesting going into the next general election cycle, how reliable those voters are when Trump is literally not on stage. Will traditional Democrats like Val Demings in Florida and Tim Ryan in Ohio outperform trendier candidates like Beto O'Rourke and Stacey Abrams? I think they will. That's going to tell you a lot about these issues like crime, schools, culture issues that I think a lot of voters hold different views on than Democrats at the moment, the party leadership and the activists. For Democrats, how sticky are issues like abortion and January 6th going to be, right? Are people still really concerned about those issues? A lot of candidates cutting ads on these issues are hoping so, but I don't think it's by accident that Kathy Hochul cut an ad on crime a couple days ago when she's been talking about abortion up till now. For Republicans, are suburban voters, sort of the inverse of this, are suburban voters so concerned about crime and education that they're willing to overlook positions that these candidates hold that are, the antithesis of their own views? So we'll see, but I think that, I think similar to 2006, it's going to reveal a lot about how regular folks are thinking about their futures and also just the real weaknesses in both parties right now. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you for laying out the landscape for us. Doug, you brought some slides for us, and I think that might feed off nicely from what Shayla was just commenting on.
Great. So it's an analytics panel. I thought I'd actually put some data up. It doesn't rise to the level of analytics, but it is data. I tested it out on the American Cosmetics Association meeting earlier today, and it was a big hit. But if there are any questions about parabens or SPF, I've got people to send you to. So I just want to throw in a few slides just to lay the groundwork here. I know the numbers are small. I know there's a lot of data. I'll just give you the main gist. The first is that first-term, midterm elections are always tough on presidents. This chart shows the last, 12, 15 first-term elections, so the first time they were up for midterm elections. And in every example except for one, the party in power lost substantial numbers of House seats. The one exception, George W. Bush after 9/11. But otherwise, it's consistent and it's clear that it's exceptionally difficult to maintain whatever status you had in the House. The Senate is more of a mixed bag, again, for some structural issues I'll point out. Now, if you take a look at the generic ballot, right, another stat that is correlated, not causally related to, but certainly correlated with House outcomes. The generic ballot has been a pretty good measure. Generic ballot, for anyone who doesn't know, is just a national survey that asks, if the election were held today, would you vote for the Republican or Democratic candidate for Congress? It's not specific to your member of Congress, but just general. If you take a look in every one of the last midterms going back to 1994, this includes first term and second term midterms, the generic ballot has been a direct predictor, again, prediction not in the analytic sense, but in the very secular sense, it's been correlated. And right now we've seen a return to a Republican advantage in the generic ballot. Things can change, streaks are made to be broken, but right now this indicates if you take those pieces of information together, plus one more, which is if you take a look at the popularity of the president at the time of their midterms, again, these are the presidents over time, going back to Eisenhower in 1954. You can see a correlation again between lower popularity and worse midterm losses. Biden today looks a lot like Trump in 2018, looks a lot like Obama in 2010, looks worse than Clinton in '94. The most recent examples of people with historically low, and I don't mean unprecedentedly low, but compared historically to peers, popularity, again, these are indicators of challenges, of the open challenges. We use the House as a good example because the entire House is up every 2 years, as most of you know. And so it's a good indication of country mood and the connection. Now, turning to the Senate, one thing I just want to point out is, as all of you know, a third of the Senate is reelected every 2 years. So what ends up happening is one party tends to have a structural advantage. What do I mean by that? That one party has more seats up for reelection than the other party. By an incredible coincidence, in every midterm election going back to 1994, the Democrats have had more seats up for reelection than Republicans. They've actually faced a structural disadvantage. It's a total coincidence. There's no conspiracy. It just happens to be the case. This is the first midterm elections where Democrats have an advantage, meaning Republicans have 21 seats up for reelection. Democrats have 14 seats. That structural advantage is, if you were to put check marks on, a lot of check marks on the Republican side, a check mark on the Democratic side for outcomes. And so, one other thing that I just think is really important to note, and this may be a bit of a change in politics, I think it's a bit of a change in culture, is everybody's upset all the time, right? I think we see that in our day-to-day life. But is there anybody that you know that's like really thrilled about the way things are going? Or look at their political leaders and say, I want more of that, right? If you look at...
President.
That's fair. But ask him about vaccine availability for young children, and he will have a different opinion. But to be clear, we just are in a state where voters always think the country is going in the wrong direction. Voters are consistently dissatisfied with the economy. There are good reasons why they feel that way. But to that point, we have now, for the first time in American history, had 5 straight presidents begin their terms with unified government. And not only that, each time it's reversed. Clinton with a Democratic government, the unified Democratic Congress. George W. Bush with a unified Republican Congress. Barack Obama with a unified Democratic Congress. Trump with a unified Republican Congress. Biden with a unified Democratic Congress. What is it we know? I remember in the early 90s, academic books that said the permanent Democratic majority of the House, and what happened in 1994, it flipped. Flipping is the new stability. And just to finish out here, negative economic outlook is correlated again with lower performance. Now, having said that, now that everyone has negative economic outlook all the time, the correlations start to go away. As Shayla mentioned, I think rightly, one thing that polls can't measure, and I've got a lot of problems with the way, with the status of polls, and more importantly, the consumption of polls, is voter enthusiasm, right? We now know better about who people are going to vote for. We now know a lot less about who's going to vote, and that makes it really hard to count votes in advance. I think when this election history is written, it's going to be about Dobbs. Was that the dog that barked or the dog that didn't bark? I think that in the end is going to have as much an explanatory factor as anything. And then finally, and I throw these Senate race ratings out to say, polling has done its job. We now know what the competitive Senate races are. They're the ones in the middle. Unfortunately, we don't get to know much more, right? And I think a lot of people, and I'll just go to this, which is where my little screed here. I think the political prediction industry is a mess. I think it's rotten, and I think it's built on clicks. And I think, unfortunately, as consumers of this, it's a problem. Like, how many read the CNN polls that came out today? I did, and my mood lightened as a former Democratic pollster. I'm the problem, right? They shouldn't lighten. I shouldn't get upset because of this. They're structurally flawed analytics. The foundational data of presidential predictions and of reporting on them is what the latest poll is that somebody read. And that is a problem. And also, irrefutable predictions. Nate Silver saying there's a 60% chance that Democrats are going to win the Senate. No, it's 50%. No, it's 53%. Guess what he is on election day? Right. Right? Or, another example is, it's there for Fetterman to win, but he's doing a good job losing it. Like, people say things that mean nothing. Or it all comes down to turnout. Again, the analysis really is if it's data-driven, it's on flawed data, and then worst of all is when it's not data-driven. So that's all I have to say, and then just a quick pitch, I'll talk about it, but especially the undergrads here, please consider the analytics program, political analytics program. We're teaming up not just with great faculty, but also with practitioners in New York, Washington, and other places. And if you look at the money that's in there, if you just think about your career, it is an ever-expanding pot of money. And what we're finding is we are, and as these very esteemed colleagues can tell you, we're spending more on things that are less and less effective. And the result is we're throwing even more at it. So,
Thank you, Doug. So Aaron Strauss, Doug has just thrown out a challenge here about the use of evidence and analytics. And so you've been a strong advocate for the use of evidence-based strategies in political campaigns. So I was wondering if you could say more about what that means and maybe respond some to Doug and his relatively bleak view of what's going on with evidence-based use of data these days.
Oh, I totally agree with Doug. And the thing you said at the end where don't doom scroll on Twitter for the latest polling, 100% correct. That I can say with absolute certainty with a percentage. And the reason is that if you're in a close race, it doesn't matter if the latest poll has you up to or down to or dead even. You should try your hardest to win that race, and you will try your hardest to win that race. The operative question is, how should you be trying to win that race? What should you be doing? How will you know if you're on the right track? And I think that since we're at a university with a great program in political analytics, I want to talk to mostly the students, or at least the beginning of my talk. There'll be a Q&A for the people who've already graduated with all the degrees they want to ask me questions later. But let's say, I'm going to think about this two ways. Let's say you're into analytics and you want to know if you want to go into political analytics. And let's say you're into politics, but you're not sure if you want to go into political analytics. So for the first one, let's say you're a numbers person and you love figuring out causality. I will say it is a bit easier on the business side. This gives you a window into what us political practitioners have to deal with. If you're working at a brick and mortar store or something, a national chain, this is the old school way to figure out if your advertising is working, how to get new sales. You try something in, ideally, as Professor Green would tell you, a randomized set of geographies where you have stores at a potentially randomized even set of timings for when to have those advertisements out or to mail the Bed Bath & Beyond coupons to people's randomized doors, and you watch the sales data come in and you see, okay, did my new advertising campaign with the squawking chicken or the talking Aflac duck actually make a difference in getting me more customers and more sales? Unfortunately, in this country, we have a secret ballot. Fortunately in this country, we have a secret ballot, which makes my job a little more difficult in political analytics, where we don't know how people are going to vote or how they're thinking at a specific time without surveying them. And with survey response rates going down, it's even more challenging these days. In fact, the gulf is alas, getting wider between analytics and the business side and political analytics, because the actual business analytics these days is what Instagram ad for some random piece of clothing, you can Google and read articles about this, will get me the most clicks and therefore make money on this thing I wasn't even invested in, but happens to be the new trend and I can resell. It's an unfortunate state of our social media, but that's the world we're in, and it's incredibly easy to A/B test your Instagram ad to find out what generates the most clicks. And by A/B test, I mean you have Instagram ad A here and Instagram ad B here, and you randomly, Instagram will help you randomly show one or the other to the folks who look at your promoted ad, and you can track easily the conversions for one or the other. That actually works really well in political fundraising analytics, because there you have a direct feedback on, again, ad A or fundraising email A or text message A versus text message B randomly sent out to people's cell phones and hopefully not put in their spam folders unless you're the recipient, in which case I do hope they go on to my spam folder, and see which one raises more dollars. So there you have a really direct way to measure. In politics, you have to get more creative, or you have to be a little bit more patient. So with persuasion, if I have two television ads and I want to know which one is doing better, the fastest way to do that is to go to an online sample via an online panel who's going to bring people who've signed up to take surveys into your survey for you. It's very nice business that is just turnkey, and you can randomly show them either ad A, ad B, or no ad. And after they've seen those ads, you can ask them who they would vote for. Now, this is not a perfect reflection of the electorate. These are people who like taking online surveys, so it's not ideal, but that is the sort of compromise that we have to do in the real world when it comes to politics, because we can't just brain scan people in various media markets and immediately see the effect of our ad by understanding whether we're changing minds in real time. I wish we could, but instead we have to get a little bit more creative. And on the patient side of things, for Turnout, which Professor Green has done hundreds of experiments on, you run an experiment, again, randomizing people, households, zip codes, counties for one election, and randomly doing something in that area, either a mailer, a canvas, even a television ad, which now probably goes to smart TV, and observe after the election, months after the elections, when the counties release their voter files and they get aggregated up, and to see if your intervention made an impact on turnout. And therefore, you have to wait until then the next election rolls around to actually implement that, instead of on the business side just implementing it next month. So the upside, though, is once you have made those discoveries and can optimize your program, then you win elections and can change the world for the better, which is not always true on the business side of things. It's probably, Doug can attest to it, though cosmetics, you know, it has its pluses for people's mental state, I'm sure. And so the other side of things is that if you're into politics and you want to go into political analytics, here's the picture. Again, these are the challenges. I don't want to scare you off, but just to know what you're getting into. You're toiling away for your beloved candidate day in, day out, and you have finally juggled all of the small p politics of what ad you're going to show voters or the mailer you're going to put out. Do you really want to know, after all that said and done, the effect of your mailer that's already been decided and already been printed and might come back with a null or zero result, and then cost you the funding for the next either election or cycle if you're in an organization? That's actually a tough proposition. That is not for the faint of heart. And the key you have to balance is those internal incentives to just be done with it and say, that was amazing, don't you just love that ad, regular, or not regular, weird political operative who's not like a regular voter. You look at that ad and say, oh yeah, I love that, I'll give you more money for it next time. I mean, that's a good place to be in. Who really wants to know if that ad actually changed the mind of regular voters? I mean, some people don't, but the people I work with do, and that is why I love them and why we maintain rigor, and it helps us win the next election. So the payoff is great. The road may be a bit treacherous at times, or at least uphill. And so that's not to scare you away, but to show you that nothing easy is ever worth doing. We'll put it that way.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Professor Don Green, as Aaron pointed out, you've been a pioneer in the area of field experiments, especially with elections and turnout. So I was wondering if you could follow up on his comments to tell us more about the state of knowledge with regard to turnout and experiments, and maybe share some stories about what you've been involved with recently with trying to figure out what is going on with turnout. How can we increase, decrease turnout, particular people, or I know you've been involved in a lot of very interesting campaigns and a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff that I think the audience would be fascinated to hear about.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've been working on these randomized experiments since the 1990s. I mean, it sounds like Methuselah here, but the basic idea is to do the equivalent of a pharmaceutical trial. So if you're interested in sort of the analytic side of political analytics, you can't get more sciencey than this brand of political science, because as Dr. Strauss mentioned just a moment ago, we essentially take large numbers of registered voters and randomly assign them to some kind of treatment, whether it be direct mail or phone calls or whatever, or control, maybe the absence of anything, and then wait until after the election to gather up voter turnout records for everybody, which conveniently in the United States is made possible. It's not so easy in say, France or England, but it's very easy here. And we simply tabulate the turnout rate in treatment and control and then declare some kind of verdict with respect to the effectiveness of that tactic. Now, what we found a few hundred randomized trials into this is that there's a fundamental trade-off that's not very surprising, actually, between quantity and quality. If you think about the coming midterm election, it'll probably attract something in the order of 55% of the voting eligible population. That to us is high voter turnout. It's the second lowest voter turnout in any Western democracy, but for us it's relatively good. And so you might wonder, well, what kind of intervention would get a, say, 19-year-old Latinx woman in Washington Heights to vote? And the answer is, well, typically it's going to take quite the light touch intervention. It's pretty unusual for a light touch intervention like an email or a robocall to have much of an effect at all. In fact, in the case of robocalls, it's almost a perfect record of never working. In the case of email, again, pretty much a perfect record of never doing anything appreciable. Now, in the case of other interventions, you can sometimes spice them up with some interesting messaging, but the basic stipulation here is that the typical light touch intervention is going to have something on the order of maybe a third of a percentage point effect. So for every roughly 1,000 people you contact, you're going to generate 3 or 4 votes. And so the idea is you either have to do this on such a grand scale in order to produce a lot of votes, or you have to think of a way to amp up its quality. You'd like to be able to do both quantity and quality, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But so how would you amp up the quality? Well, you could give it more of a personal flavor in the sense that you could have a conversation with people, you could explain to them the importance of the upcoming election, you could signal how important it is to you, and those kinds of high-touch interventions tend to work well, maybe an order of magnitude better than the light touch interventions, but they're very difficult to orchestrate at scale, especially in a non-presidential year where it's hard to get roving bands of Manhattanites to go to Pennsylvania. It's just hard. And so the difficulty is this trade-off between quantity and quality. Now, one of the interesting things, we can talk a little bit about messaging, and maybe I'll come back to that, but one of the interesting things is that the advent of social media and the advent of smartphones has made it possible for us to curate, vast numbers of contacts in our own personal little directory. And these people are very easy for us to reach out to because they know us, and there are, cousins or, housemates or, maybe they're co-congregants or fellow workers, and they won't block us if we try to text them and encourage them to vote. And that turns out to be an incredibly effective strategy. But of course, orchestrating this on a grand scale meets with 2 problems. One is you actually have to do it. You actually have to get people together and get them fired up enough to do it. And that tends to be a recruiting problem. And the other is, of course, that the business market for this, the campaign consultant market, isn't all that vigorous because it's not that easy to make a lot of money doing that. Yeah, exactly. It would be better to one day, but one day there will be possible. But for now, it's kind of right now 2022. It's an uphill battle. So the idea then is you can develop one kind of get out the vote campaign if you have adequate people power, and you could probably do quite a good job with it. If you have a truckload of money, you'll probably run a very different campaign, and how you balance the trade-off between quantity and quality is really going to be a matter of art form. So what is that art form? Well, a lot of it kind of comes down to some of the A/B tests that were described before, where you're literally doing randomized trial after randomized trial to do 2 things. One is to figure out what kind of message works best, and the other is to figure out which kind of receiver is the most responsive to your messaging. So if you thought about taking a class in machine learning, the latter is a purely kind of empirical exercise where you're just going to figure out who the most treatment responsive is of your subject pool. And so those are the kinds of things that kind of lay out the broad research agenda of pointy-headed types like me, where you pretty much envision a sea of randomized experiments where you're going to figure out which combinations of mode, messenger, message, receiver tend to produce the biggest harvest of votes. And then you just optimize over that as best you can over subsequent elections, knowing, of course, full well that the internal politics of the campaign are not necessarily going to follow your advice. That typically the campaigns are going to waste a ton of money on worthless television ads, and there's nothing you can do about that. But if there's any money left over, especially down the stretch of the campaign, you can make good on your promise to deliver votes through voter turnout. The last thing I'd say is it's kind of an interesting and emerging literature comparing the effectiveness of two different tactics. Voter turnout on the one hand and persuasion on the other. And you might say, well, okay, they're both ways of getting votes. You can bring a bigger army to the battlefield and win races that way, or you could try to win the support of your former opponents or the people who are indifferent, bring them over to your side. One of the things that's happened over the last few decades is that campaign consultants and big donors and activists on both sides have wanted increasingly to wage a war on the voter turnout front because that way they can run a more sort of ideologically muscular campaign, which is much more to their liking, and they don't have to make compromises with the other side ideologically. So the net effect of a lot of the kind of trajectory of this kind of politics is mobilizing the base, doing less to reach out to the center, to independents. And so that's a kind of interesting reflection in some sense of the evolution of campaign strategy over the long haul. Let me leave it there since there's plenty more to say, but I've already said too much.
Thank you, Don. So I want to bring the conversation back to some issues with polling. And Bob Shapiro, I doubt there's anybody who has paid as close attention as you have to the recent challenges and complications that have risen with political polling. We're inundated with polls every day in the political season. And there's a sense that the polls have been off compared to election outcomes. So I was wondering if you could comment on some of the complications that have arisen and how those who run polls and try to gauge public opinion are dealing with them.
Okay, thank you. Before I answer your question as directly as I can, I just want to make a comment about the program. It's a program in political analytics, but the kinds of skills you're going to learn in the program apply to all kinds of analytic problems related to the attitudes and behavior of individuals more broadly. So I expect people will go through the program, but they may wind up in jobs that look at something else other than politics, and perhaps things that are more interesting. And in addition to all the analytic skills, and in addition to all of the analytic skills, what I hope the program will do, and I would be a big proponent of it, is to teach you how to communicate, write about, and speak about the findings that come out of the kind of analytics that you do. And the panelists were a great example of people who are skilled in the analytics, but who can also talk about it and communicate it to you. And I think that's another important talent and skill that one should have. Now, in terms of being bombarded by polling, we were bombarded by polls in the presentation that we saw. Now, the problem of polling is something that the public has picked up on. And we know after the recent elections, people were claiming that the polls are bad. And how do we know that people thought the polls were bad? We did polls to find out that the polls were bad. The claim that the polls are bad is an imprecise statement. The problem in polling is not polls in general. It's in election polling, and more precisely, it was election polling in particular states. Now, some of the data you saw were based on responses to survey questions and polls about national perceptions of the economy, who people will vote for in response to the generic question about voting for a Democrat or Republican in the upcoming House election. Those were not so much the problematic polls, but rather were the ones in some of the the key states, and in particular, the polls that I wonder about that you saw the slide on, was the polls that showed tight races in particular Senate seats. And I think there, the fact that they're showing tight races there, you can believe that it's tight races. It's perhaps in some of the other races that would be forecasting larger leads by candidates, where if those were wrong, that's where all the outcry is going to wind up being. Now, the problem in polling in elections are twofold. One is, compared to more general polling, where there are not errors, is in elections, you're trying to generalize to a population that doesn't exist yet until after Election Day. Whereas general polls are polls of the public at large, for which you know the characteristics of that population from census data. And you can adjust and weight any biases in representation of that public accordingly. The election polls, you don't know what that population is until after people have voted. Secondly, we found known biases in the state polls, and what the biases in the state polls had to do with basically a democratic bias in the polls. And the pollsters, after the 2016 election, thought they had discovered what the problem was. That is, they underweighted white working class voters, which were really white voters without college degrees. Okay, it could be white voters with some college and so forth. But and then in 2020, after the pollsters thought they had adjusted for that, well, they hadn't, because if that was a bias, they were weighting that group demographically. But the people who responded to the polls that they were weighting were different from the white working class voters who didn't respond to polls. And the pollsters now are pulling out their hair trying to figure out what they should be weighting by, and they've brought in other characteristics of the population like home ownership and things like that. And it's those kinds of things you would, if you were concerned with those kinds of things, you could learn about that in the political analytics program. But with regard to how those biases affect responses to survey questions that try to measure other kinds of attitudes and behaviors, the biases are less because the correlation of that particular kind of non-response bias is correlated with how people voted for Trump or not, but they're much more weakly correlated with people's attitudes toward political issues and attitudes toward perceptions of the economy and things of that sort. Now, there are other difficulties that have occurred in polling, and I'll try to keep this short, but the technical aspects of polling are enormous. In talking about some of the experiments were run, Aaron talked about experiments using non-probability samples, and Don talked about experiments using voter lists, and it's different there. For doing experiments, in a general sense, getting a representative sample is less important because you're more concerned about the randomized effect of a particular treatment. In the case of the field experiments on voters, you really want to study voters there. But in terms of how surveys are done, it used to be in the old days, in the early days of polling up until the 1970s, polls were done through in-person surveys, geographic sampling, and so forth, and they did pretty well with regard to election projections up to a point, and certainly in studying public attitudes. But polling over time evolved, transitioning from in-person polling to telephone polls, and then what happened over time was the big effect of the introduction of answering machines, cell phones, and people being inundated with phone calls. That as the polling industry proliferated, people were bombarded with polls. It led to a decline in response rates that used to be on the order of 70, 80% to early polls, and even some later polls. But the later polls that get those response rates that academics use, the NORC General Social Survey, the American National Election Study, can still get response rates of 50% or better, but to get that, they've got to pay a lot of money, largely today, to bribe people to participate in surveys. But the response rates we're talking about are single-digit response rates. It's a long story, but that's basically where we've begun. A lot of these polls depend very heavily on certain analytic techniques, like statistical weighting or assembling non-probability sample panels or probability sample panels. You'll learn about what those are if you enter into the political analytics program. And then adjusting those data or sampling those data to match the characteristics of the population from the American Community Survey, or weighting the data based on more complex methods like multiple regression and post-stratification analysis, which is a tool that's widely been used. So there are a lot of those details of polling, and also the methods of polling themselves, whether the polls are done by telephone, whether the polls are done on the internet, whether the polls are done, and it's been sort of a return, it's kind of back to the future. Pollsters now are experimenting, have been doing polls based on address-based sampling, and if you're going to sample based on addresses, you may as well mail a survey. So there's increasing use of mail surveys or multi-mode methods combining mail surveys, internet surveys, and telephone surveys. And how you mesh those and bring together those kinds of data has become a science in itself. And I think I'm going to stop there. I think I've tried to give people a flavor of some of the technical details that are important to consider.
Thank you. So we've thrown out a lot of information here. I wanted to give the other panelists an opportunity to respond to something that was thrown out here. Any impressions, any comments on our opposing views, or?
I want to maybe have an opposing view about the program, because I think some of what we heard was not as optimistic about what you get out of going to a program like this. And I think to that end, we may be doing a disservice to careers in politics by focusing on candidate elections. Meaning politics is now a much broader industry than that. And I would speak specifically to initiative campaigns, as well as to ongoing and consistent legislative and regulatory advocacy campaigns that are going on. So we tend to think of politics in 2-year cycles. They are monthly cycles. I'll give you 2 examples. One is I helped lead on one side of this issue. We would call this 2 well-fed groups fighting over a ham sandwich. But it was about running a transmission line from the Canadian border through the state of Maine. Okay, not the kind of thing you get up in the morning excited about. This initiative campaign in Maine in 2021, on both sides, a total of $120 million was spent on advertising, grassroots, et cetera. In California this year, there was an initiative fight in the end, it was about whether to have online sports betting, so on your phone in California. In the end, it was a battle between the tribes, who currently control all gambling in California, and outside groups, your FanDuels and all the people you see advertising. Up to October 1, the 2 sides have spent $410 million in California. They stopped on October 5th because it was clear that it was going down to defeat, a victory for the tribes. There's estimates that it could have hit $650 million by election day. In Washington, 2 summers ago, there's something that you may remember called surprise medical billing. It was an issue that was a big deal, and Congress was considering going about it. It was basically private equity versus insurance companies. In 1 month, in August, in Washington, D.C., $45 million was spent by one private equity firm to push their side of it. All the messages were the same: stop surprise medical billing, vote for S-232. Stop surprise medical billing, vote against S-232. The point, though, as I hope you're getting out of this is a career that happens all the time. And second, there are people getting rich doing this, to you undergraduates. I've been to their houses. I haven't cracked the code yet. I'm hopefully going to figure that out sometime before I retire. But there is a lot going on, and this goes well beyond the candidate elections, but literally week by week, month by month. And this is, for better or worse, the real work in American politics is a real battle over resources that happens. Analytics becomes more important because the people that are spending these money want some level of accountability.
This is a great point, and I think the money that is coming into politics really opens up some opportunities. So Professor Green was talking about quantity versus quality. And the quality he was talking about is something we call relational voter contact, where you're talking to your friends instead of knocking on a stranger's door. And the question he proposes, well, how do we bring that, we would say, up to scale? How do we bring the quantity into that quality? And a few people had the thought that, well, if we already pay campaign organizers to sit around and calling constituents and voters in the district to volunteer and knock on strangers' doors, why don't we pay a bit less, but to many more people, to talk to their friends, and an expansive list of their friends, you know, over 100 people in their phone, because we're paying them all of a sudden. And we could now, with more money in politics, afford to do something like this. And because the quality of a relational, a friend-to-friend or a family-to-family contact is so high, it actually is fairly cost-efficient. And these are the opportunities that come around because the stakes are so high. Democracy is on the line, and people, honestly, rich people, realize that too and are willing to investigate creative ways to net votes and create opportunities that weren't there before. And that is what you have to look forward to if you go into political analytics, solving these challenging problems.
Thank you. So I think we will turn it over to audience members who have questions. Again, if you're joining us online, you can submit questions through the chat and they will be brought up to me, I believe. We have a couple mic runners. I see the light is pretty glaring here. I can see somebody here. Just raise your hand, and if you have a question, and we'll try to get to you.
Thank you very much. One is a structural question. Constitutionally, you have the federal government and the states. Do you think it's time for having cities as legitimate political structures in the Constitution? And number two, the state of gerrymandering, if you can talk about that in this current year. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll turn it over to panelists, whether you think the dynamics that we've been talking about tonight would be different if we had a different structure. I mean, a lot of us are interested in political behavior in institutions, and this is a question about maybe changing institutions and how that might affect behavior.
Well, I will say on gerrymandering, this was a real missed opportunity of, unfortunately, a conservative Supreme Court to take analytics, which created some fairly reasonable criteria for what a gerrymander is, an efficiency gap, for instance, if you want to Google that after the seminar. And the Supreme Court absolutely, and a more liberal Supreme Court almost certainly would have said, just as we can count the number of people per district, and back in Supreme Court cases I think were like Baker v. Carr, we said, you have to have the same number of people per district, one person, one vote. They could have said, we'll use the efficiency gap. Just like you count up the number of people, we can count up the efficiency. Every district has to be within a certain efficiency tolerance. One person, one voting power, like the equal voting power, at least for the House. And that was really well done by political analytics. And in a different world, you know, where, I don't know, Abe Fortas doesn't get in a scandal, like that, maybe that would have been the standard, and again, we would have been rid of this gerrymandering scourge, but alas. Close, but no cigar.
Anybody else want to respond?
One thing that comes to mind, kind of riffing off of something that was said earlier by a bunch of people actually, is that, you know, the United States has the most frequent elections in the world. By far the most frequent elections in the world. We have them, you know, at every level of government. And although this might be constitutionally a mess, it does generate the largest campaign consultant class in the world because the frequent elections allow people to weather the storm over long, you know, periodicity between elections. And so that's why it is that when you look at elections in other countries, the Americanization of those elections occurs with such aplomb because the firms during off-year work here can expand to other countries. And so part of the reason to get in on the ground floor in American political analytics is just to exploit this very important feature of our electoral system.
Thank you, Don. Other questions?
I have a question. I'm a physicist by undergraduate degree, and my professor used to say, don't look at the data, but look what the data is not saying. I would like to ask questions to Doug. Like, what is data is not telling? Like, you've explored a lot of what data is saying, but what has not data spoken? I also have a question for Sally. People of color, there has been predictions about how the Latino will vote for Democrat, but that turned out to be completely wrong during the presidential elections. If you were to suggest a policy or even anything that to the Democratic Party, what would you tell the Democratic Party about what happened and how that could change the policy?
So that's a couple questions there. So Shailin, what would you say to somebody who would ask, what can we not learn from data? What is the data not telling us, or what would we like the data to tell us that it's not?
So yeah, I mean, political campaigns are really like bands, right? You need everything. You need all of these people on stage performing together to be successful. And data is important. Focus groups are important. That's the other side of the spectrum. All of this stuff informs ads and mailing. But if the message is wrong, or if you're targeting the wrong people, or you're targeting the wrong people with the wrong message, then you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars of rich people's money for nothing, which, you know, is fine with me, but it isn't really. I think we're getting to the root of why people are so frustrated with the state of democracy right now, because it's just so inadequate to the needs that we face as a country, whatever side you're on. So I think Latino voters are really good. That's a really good barometer right now of how well parties are communicating, because, and I think one of the reasons parties are communicating the way they are, is because their messaging and their focus is reinforced by activist groups that are extremely well financed and do tons of polling and say very reassuringly to Democratic House members, like, climate change is the most important thing this year, or January 6th is what everybody's worried about, or you know, lots of cultural issues that we'll see what the verdict is in a few weeks, and how much people really care about those issues. What most people, I think that the message that seems to be emerging from a few of these more compelling candidates in the field right now, I think Tim Ryan in Ohio is probably the most interesting Democrat for like the folks in Washington at the moment, because he doesn't talk about being a Democrat, but he has this sort of economic patriotism message. It's sort of Bernie, more of a Midwestern populism, but it is absolutely, he doesn't speak to cultural issues, he doesn't speak to racial and ethnic issues, he just is talking kind of past those issues to people and the state that they're in right now. And I think that is, what are we not asking? Well, we're not asking a lot of those questions right now, because we can't see past these defined issue buckets that have really emerged out of this activist class that in both parties is really dictating the agenda. And I say this as someone who maybe will return to politics one day, but I find it really demoralizing, and hope that all of these numbers people will contribute to our path, maybe to a better place. I hope you get rich along the way, but I also hope that maybe we get more people to vote. Maybe we're not talking about issues vis-a-vis like what your identity is and where you live, and these kind of buckets that we've seen people in for a long time, to pretty dim effect.
So we have a question that has been submitted from one of our streamers. I think I understand the gist of it, which is about how election polling is an emerging area in nonprofit work, but there are different challenges in the nonprofit world. Those of you who are working in the trenches, are there differences? Are there, in terms of biases or weakness of data, when you're dealing with working with nonprofits and who are not necessarily seeking to elect particular candidates?
Right. So we're doing some work right now for a couple of nonprofits, and I think what you have in there is what I like to call issue tunnel vision. And this is true of almost all of our clients. They are sure that to use an apocryphal example, taxes on liquid nitrogen are the most compelling issue to voters. More seriously, I think that in some of the world of climate change, which we've done some work in other areas, there is a bit of tunnel vision about the importance of the issue versus the headspace of the typical voter. And so you can always run a poll that's going to show the importance of an issue and the ways in which you can win by talking about that issue. It's much more challenging to run a poll that actually recreates the context of an election. And then also, most important is it's really hard to get a client, and nonprofit is notorious for people spending their entire careers in one issue space, to help convince them to contextualize the issue and that it is very important and it still doesn't register. I'm not saying climate change in that case, but I'm saying more liquid nitrogen taxes, but you get the gist.
And here's the dichotomy I don't think enough people understand, is that when you're trying to lower taxes on liquid nitrogen, that's what we're trying to do, what you really need, so in order to lower taxes on liquid nitrogen, what you need is 30 passionate people in this state that has the stupid high taxes on liquid nitrogen to really bug the state legislature. And those 30 people to get into meetings, to do phone calls, to do events that get on the news, to just be a nuisance and raise a ruckus. And you don't need that many people to be passionate about that topic to make a difference. Whereas, as you're saying, the liquid nitrogen lobby gets tunnel vision and thinks their issue, because they've raised ruckus and 30 people have loved it, is like that's the key issue that will win the election for us. And what the data isn't telling us, to go back to that question, is it isn't telling us that us weird people who are highly educated, love politics, go to seminars where people are going to talk about political data. Who does that? Free refreshments. Oh, that's true. That's true. That we are normal. We like free food, and that we are somehow that the arguments that work for us are somehow will resonate with the swing or the median voter, and that is data that doesn't bark. And I think Doug, it sounds like you have to deal with this even more than I do in my job. It would be awesome if the same messages and arguments that work to convince me that being a progressive that believed in a better world where we are all together and openness and respected each other and shared and had more sense of community, those messages were the same messages that worked on the self-interested median voter, but they just aren't, unfortunately. And that's a lesson that we have to learn over and over again, because there are always new people who come in with their own passions, with their own needs for low liquid nitrogen taxes, and we have to understand that that's not the day-to-day concern of the median voter.
We have time for one more question. There was a question up here.
Thank you very much. I read an article in Axios a few weeks ago that was about the use of artificial intelligence in campaigning and especially in fundraising. Do you think it has an impact, or it's more of a gadget?
Anyone want to take that question? On that?
Fundraising is a great example of something that can be done in the same real time as the science that was discussed as business science, because you get an envelope, filling with cash if you're doing well and not if you're doing badly. And so you'll know almost instantly whether your messages are effective or not by randomly assigning different targets to different messages. The machine learning part comes in two ways. One is through so-called adaptive trials that randomly assign more and more of the winning message to voters, and at the same time figure out which types of recipients are most responsive to those messages. So you could have, the heartfelt views of a progressive winning lots of campaign contributions in, say, California, but not so much in New Hampshire. And so the question is how to optimize. And so the idea is through a combination of experimental design and machine learning, you can kind of figure out how to make the optimal combination of messages and recipients. Now, it might take you a while. It might be expensive, but that's good for consulting business.
Thank you, Don. We're at time, so I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank everybody for coming. So if you could join me in a round of applause for our panel discussion. So you are all invited to reception right out through these doors in the low rotunda, and hopefully we can continue the conversation. I know some of you had questions that we didn't get to, but I'll be around. Some of them will stick around, and we can have more discussion. But thank you all.